Good evening and welcome. I'm Liz McGonigal, the director of the Kansas African Studies Center, and the center is so pleased to host Aminata Forna tonight and have you all with us. Thank you for being here. It's been a very long week. Aminata Forna's breadth as a writer of fiction, memoir, and essays, along with her very storied career as a journalist and a broadcaster, speaks to her wide reach within a university setting such as ours. There are more than a dozen other units at the University of Kansas who are co-sponsoring this special presentation. I'd like to thank them all for their generous support. They are the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the Center for Global and International Studies, the Department of History, the School of Journalism, the Center for Migration Research, the Department of African and African American Studies, the new Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the Humanities Program, the Department of English, the School of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, the Department of Film and Media Studies, the KU Office of Multicultural Affairs, and the Hall Center for the Humanities, who's graciously offered us the use of this space for this talk and also for the book signing afterward. So please join us for that, and we have books available for purchase. Tonight's event was also made possible by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and my colleague Byron Santangelo will say more about our work in the Kansas African Studies Center with this funding shortly. Also here with us this evening, representing the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, is Henry Bile, who will offer some opening remarks. He is an Associate Dean for International and Interdisciplinary Studies in the college, as well as the Director of the School of Arts, and a professor in the Department of Theater. So please join me in welcoming Associate Dean Bile.
Thank you, Liz. On behalf of Dean of the College, Cara Lejwe, and all of us in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, I want to welcome you. I want to welcome our speaker. Thank you all for joining us. The slogan we have in the college is learning without borders, and nowhere is that more true than in the Division of Interdisciplinary and International Programs. And certainly, the Kansas African Studies Center is a model of both interdisciplinarity and internationalism, and that's really important. At times like these, I often try to remember, as de Certeau said, that what the map cuts up, the story cuts across. And I think that's very much what the Spirit of the Migration Stories project is about, and very much what tonight's speaker represents. And so we're really excited. We see the interdisciplinarity coming out in the many, many partners within and without the college who came together to make this happen. And if you take anything away from tonight, let's try to remember that it's not possible to tell the story of Kansas or of America without also telling the story of Africa. And so with that, I'm going to hand it off to Byron Kavanagh Santangelo.
Thank you all for coming out this evening. I'm Byron Santangelo, and I'm a professor of English and Environmental Studies here at KU. And as Liz mentioned, I'm the co-director of the Migration Stories Initiative that's run by the Kansas African Studies Center and funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. The initiative focuses on facilitating the creation and spread of stories about African immigration in the Midwest and the U.S. more generally. The hope is that this project will highlight the value of stories for productive dialogue about migration and identity, and the value of sharing stories for reframing public discussions about immigration. So some of the questions that guide our project include, what are different stories about immigration and how can they be accessed? How can stories that have been unheard be made accessible? How might stories enable productive dialogue and the production of more stories? And how do people's stories about themselves change through the experience of immigration? So Migration Stories is part of the National Endowment for the Humanities, Humanities in the Public Square initiative, intended to draw on the humanities as a means to enable community dialogue about pressing controversial social issues. And this just started. This was the first cycle of grants for this Humanity in the Public Squares initiative. What we've done already, we had a public forum in May in Kansas City. We had a panel discussion that included well-known Nigerian author Chris Abani, and we had a lively discussion. And there we were trying to get initial thoughts about some of these themes and initial answers to our questions to get a sense of where we would be going. And one of the aspects of these public square grants that I like is that they require us all to have a forum so that the public can help guide the direction of the grant. We've also had workshops that have been focused on storytelling and theater. The theater one involved high school students. The storytelling workshop primarily included college students here at KU and elsewhere. And we are currently in the process of planning a poetry workshop that we're hoping to have in either Wichita or Garden City. We're also running book discussions and film discussions around Kansas. Many of these, though, have been in Garden City, which is a major center for African immigrants. It's also the site of thwarted terrorist violence against Somali refugees. I don't know how many of you have heard about that, which a number of terrorists were arrested when they were planning, after it was discovered that they were planning on bombing I think it was an apartment complex with Somali refugees. We've also had 2 radio shows, public radio shows, both based in Kansas City. An important part of the initiative involves the collecting of stories about migration, both from immigrants and from members of host communities. And if you're interested in sharing a story, or you know of somebody who might be, you can find the website where you can share those stories here on this description of the grant that's on the table outside.
Also on the program.
And also on the program, great. Thanks, Jessica. I want to end by thanking the NEH for funding this project at this critical juncture. Now more than ever, we need to find ways to foster productive dialogue around the issue of migration in the Midwest and the U.S. more generally. We also need to find ways to promote tolerance and the celebration of diversity. And what I fear is that a project like this, in the years to come, projects like this might not be funded. And let's very much hope that that is not the case. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you to Henry and Byron for getting us underway. I also want to thank members of the Center, Mackenzie Jones and Jessica Irving, who've been working behind the scenes to make all of this happen this evening. It's now my pleasure to say just a few words to you to introduce our distinguished speaker tonight. Aminata Forna is an author, broadcaster, and journalist. She was born in Scotland, raised in Sierra Leone and Britain, and spent periods of her childhood in Iran, Thailand, and Zambia. She's currently a Lannan Visiting Chair at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and prior appointments have been at Bath Spa University and Williams College in Massachusetts. She's also a columnist for The Guardian, and her writing has appeared in Granta, The Times, The Observer, and Vogue. She's acted as a judge for a number of literary awards, including the International Man Booker Prize. Forna is the award-winning author of 3 novels. Her most recent novel, The Hired Man, was declared a Best Book of the Year by NPR, the Boston Globe, and the San Francisco Chronicle. Set in Croatia, this suspenseful story centers on a local hunter and his friendship with a British family that has come to occupy a house in a town with a dark and infamous history. The past begins to bubble to the surface as the locals make their unhappiness with the outsiders known. When I joined my first book club ever just last year, mostly among strangers who have come to be friends, I chose The Hired Man as my selection. Everyone loved it, and it turned my trial membership in this club into a permanent one. So I have to say thank you very much for sharing your talent through literature, and know that your work has reverberating effects in ways both large and small. A second novel by Forna, The Memory of Love, was published in 2010 and was the winner of the Commonwealth Writers' Prize Best Book Award and shortlisted for the Orange Prize. The Memory of Love is set in contemporary Sierra Leone at a hospital where the patients are coping with the wounds, both physical and psychological, from the country's civil war. Forna's debut novel from 2006, Ancestor Stones, won the PEN Hurston Wright Legacy Award. Ancestor Stones encompasses a sweeping view of Africa in the 20th century, told through the story of Abby, newly returned to Africa from England, and that of her 4 aunts, in whose divergent lives Forna renders the changes and upheavals of history, culminating in political turmoil. But it was back in 2002 when Forna first gained serious literary attention for her memoir, The Devil That Danced on the Water, in which she investigates the murder of her father, Mohamed Forna, a rising star in Sierra Leone's fledgling democracy. Upon her return to the country to investigate his murder, she discovers the far-reaching conspiracy plot that sealed his tragic fate, and powerfully confronts the politicians and judges that were responsible. A runner-up for the Samuel Johnson Prize in 2003, The Devil That Danced on the Water was also chosen for the Barnes & Noble Discover New Writers series. This critically acclaimed memoir was serialized on BBC Radio 4 and extracted in the Sunday Times newspaper. In her work, Aminata Forna evokes the violence buried in history and its reverberation in ways that few writers can match, both in her haunting fiction and illuminating lived experiences. Her talk tonight, From Root to Branch, Travels in the Footsteps of the Enslaved, will allow us to gain a deeper understanding of identities through a thoughtful reflection on the long history of forced migration from Africa to America. Please join me in welcoming Aminata Forna back to Lawrence.
Thank you so much. A wonderful introduction. I'm flattered and delighted to be introduced in that way and to see so many of you here tonight. I'm often asked to speak about migration, and I typically say no because I am not and have never been an immigrant. And this surprises people because I think there's a presumption that if you're a brown person in a mainly white country that you must have somehow immigrated to that country. But I haven't. However, I come from 2 countries where there has been a long history of emigration, typically forced. My father from Sierra Leone, my mother from Scotland. Sierra Leone's history of emigration started with the slave trade and more recently with the war in Sierra Leone, which saw a large number of refugees coming to Britain, to the United States. And my mother's country, Scotland, which saw huge numbers of Scottish people leaving during the enclosures several centuries ago when land was taken away from a local population. And many people went to Canada, to Australia, to New Zealand. So we all, in one way or another, whether we have emigrated or not, typically have some sort of connection with migration. I am going to talk about a new essay. I wrote it some months ago. It appears in a new anthology called Freeman's. This is the second one. The first one was in fact called Arrivals. And many of the greatest writers in this country and overseas contributed to that, and it dealt very directly with some of the issues that we're going to talk about tonight. This one, the theme of it is family, and once again, many of the writers, Alexander Hemon, for example, writes about being a Bosnian refugee here in the States and his family coming from Bosnia and settling in Canada. Quite a few of the writers look at family through the story of migration. And so did I. But I didn't look at my immediate family. I looked at people who are connected to me by DNA, who came to this country many, many, many decades ago in a very different way from the way that I arrived in this country. When I say I have never been a migrant, not quite true, I am now, because I came to live here a year ago. But it's my first direct experience of immigration to a third nation. I actually just grew up between Sierra Leone and Scotland, and I simply saw myself, as was referred to earlier, not as a migrant, but as an international citizen. I simply live in more than one country, and as was referred to, I actually grew up for periods of time in Iran and in Thailand and in Zambia. That was because my stepfather was a UN, appropriately, United Nations diplomat. And so I grew up in those countries. So I got a very strong, I've always grown up with a very strong sense of how countries look at each other and see each other, how similar they are. I mean, my view has always been that countries are remarkably similar. People have differences of experience, and that can lead to differences in thinking. But essentially, wherever you go in the world, you find the same people over and over again, the same kinds of characters. And that's something that's really informed my writing, is to think about how does that experience, how do our individual experiences shape the people we become, shape the way we think about the world. And if I can put that down on paper, and I can persuade another person with another experience of the world to walk the walk of my character, will they see the world through their eyes? And I think that's what I've always tried to bring to my writing, which is why I write so much in the first person, is to allow people to inhabit the world of the character, be they a fictional character or a non-fictional character. Walk their walk, see what it's like, see how it feels. You know, there are studies which demonstrate that reading literature creates empathy. And I really do believe that. I believe that if you inhabit the soul of another person over 300 pages, it is very hard to put that book down and not understand how that person became what they are. So I'm going to read tonight talk and read a little bit tonight from Freeman, from my essay. It's called Crossroads. You'll know why in a moment. But I'll tell you a little bit more about how I came to be, because when I was asked if I might give this talk, my essay was already out, actually. It had just been published, and I thought this is a great opportunity to talk about my experience of migration. And also, I started to cast my mind back, and I thought, well, actually, you know, why am I here? I don't mean that in an existential way. I mean that in a literal way. How did I come to be? And I came to be because of the expansionist migratory ambitions of the United Kingdom, of England, in fact, as it was then. I came to be really because of the Berlin Conference of 1884. Do you know what happened there? Well, Africa was split up. Africa was split up between the European powers, and Britain already had an interest in Sierra Leone, a small colony. It became a protectorate. And the way in which the continent was carved up, Sierra Leone went to Britain. And fast forward some decades, from 1884 to the 1960s, Britain has governed Sierra Leone for 60, 70 years. The Second World War has happened. Britain is desperate to divest itself of its colonial obligations, as is France and the other colonial powers. Germany, of course, had theirs taken away, but by this time the European powers cannot any longer afford their colonies, and they're keen to divest themselves. So one of many things that takes place before independence is an attempt to create a middle class, a professional middle class, to whom the British could hand over running of these former colonies at the point of independence. And this is done in the scramble out of Africa was faster than the scramble in. The scramble out of Africa takes place in 15 years. And one of the things that Britain and the other colonial powers did was that they offered scholarships to smart young men and women from the colonies to go and study in Britain, in order that these people would be the engineers, the lawyers, the doctors, the functionaries in their countries, and they would go back and run the country. And my father was one of those people. He went to Britain as a medical student in the late 1950s. Wole Soyinka, the great Nigerian writer, calls them the Renaissance generation. They were supposed to, they came of age at the same time as their countries, and they were supposed to lead their countries into this bright new future, into this, what everybody at the time hoped would be a Renaissance. That didn't transpire the way we had imagined, but that's what they were, and they were men and women of enormous hope, enormous ability, and utter optimism. You know, the world really was in their hands. And, you know, I grew up with these men and women. As a child, I grew up with them. It was an absolutely extraordinary time of great hope. As I wrote about The Devil That Danced in the Water, my memoir, that hope didn't, in most cases, didn't turn into a reality. But they were extraordinary people to grow up with. And they did, overwhelmingly, all return to their countries after their scholarship programs were ended, back to their countries of origin. Of course, if you leave a young man in Britain for 10 years, certain things will happen. And my father met my mother. So actually, I always say the only person in my family who ever emigrated anywhere was my Scottish mother, who went to Sierra Leone. When I was 6 months old, we all went to Sierra Leone, and that was where I, in the main, grew up. Some political difficulties required us to leave and come back. But essentially, that was what we regarded as home. It was Sierra Leone, was what we regarded as home. I think my mother knew almost nothing about Sierra Leone when she arrived there. She was in her early 20s. She had 3 children. She had a husband. I think she had absolutely no idea what she was going to, and she didn't know the history of the country. She didn't know that Sierra Leone's history with Britain had started centuries ago in the 1600s, when Queen Elizabeth I walked into her court and decided there were far too many people of colour, and she passed what was called the Blackamoor's Edict. And she ordered that the black population of London be sent to Sierra Leone. And that was when the first British colony in Sierra Leone arose. And then later on, Britain's relationship with Sierra Leone was through slavery. Britain, as I'm sure you know, was a huge slaving power, and many tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of Sierra Leoneans and West Africans went from that coast that was then called the Slave Coast to the Americas, to North America and to the West Indies in a forced migration. So this was something that was not taught. Certainly, I went to school in Britain. My Sierra Leonean parent, my Sierra Leonean father, had a great respect for British education, and he sent me to school there. We certainly were not told this part of Britain's relationship with Sierra Leone. We were told about Wilberforce. We were taught that part of it. And as much as we were taught about the colonies was the pink bits on the map, and this lot sent rubber, and this lot sent iron or gold or whatever it was. But we were not given the shadow side of Britain's relationship with her colonies. So I learned the history of Sierra Leone's relationship to Britain and to the Americas through slavery, really by a process of osmosis. And actually also a lot through the program Roots. Do you remember Roots of the 1970s? I mean, that was really sort of my formative education in the history of slavery in this country and the connection to West Africa. And over the years, anyway, you know, I read about it, I educated myself, I found out about it. But there were other aspects of it that I learned from being in Sierra Leone, from growing up in Sierra Leone, from observing what was around me. And so this is the subject of my essay. It's called Crossroads, as I've already said. It's about being in Sierra Leone, it's about growing up there, it's about seeing that, and then it's also about coming to America. I've lived here 3 times in my life. I was a fellow at Berkeley many years ago. I've taught at Williams College a couple of times, and now I'm at Georgetown, where I teach. And really beginning over the years of my relationship with this country to see the connections, the cultural footprints of the people who share their DNA with me in this country. The first, I think my first really direct encounter with the history of slavery in Sierra Leone was through, let me read this, through a certain kind of person that we began to encounter in Sierra Leone in the 1960s and 1970s. In Sierra Leone before the war of 1991 to 2002, a certain kind of traveller disembarked regularly from flights from the United States, alongside the missionaries and Peace Corps volunteers. Around their necks they wore pendants in the shape of Africa. They dressed in shirts and skirts made of printed kente cloth, and they had African names which were not the names they had been given when they were born. They were African Americans come home. My last visit to Sierra Leone before the war made it impossible was in 1991. In the company of a group of friends, I celebrated my birthday at a restaurant called Old Wine, New Skins, which had been set up by a family of African American returnees, as we called them. We would later retrieve the term to describe Sierra Leoneans who came home from overseas at the end of the war. They were a man and his 3 wives. This made some among us roll our eyes, just as we were working to rid ourselves of polygamy. It was even said that one of the wives was white. They opened a restaurant and specialized in cooking our own food and then selling it to expats, which they did rather well, balancing the flavors to satisfy the requirements of local authenticity while serving Western tastes. Why hadn't we thought of it? The man wore dreadlocks and a Gara shirt. When he came to take our order, he called us sister and brother. The women wore long robes of Dutch wax print. All night, we tried for a glimpse of the white wife, but we achieved none. Why did they choose us when others of their countrymen headed for Ghana, so much more developed, so much more distinguished? These were the days before you could acquire a DNA test for a handful of dollars. But the fact is, whether or not they knew it, the family was more likely to share DNA with us than any other peoples on the west coast of Africa. Sierra Leone's other name, the one it was known by to the outside world and for several hundred years, was the Slave Coast. Only a minority of all the slaves taken from West Africa went to North America. Most ended up in South America and the West Indies. But of those who went north, a good many came from Sierra Leone, a significant proportion from a single trading fort on a small island just off the coast of Sierra Leone called Bunce Island. I grew up going to Bunce as a child. Has anyone ever been there? Yeah. You know what it's like. It's extraordinary. The old slave fort is still there. There are still, I don't know, about 20 or 30 cannons round it. The walls still stand. It has weathered time remarkably well. It stood there for, I don't know, a couple of hundred years, I'm guessing. It was Portuguese first, and then it was British. And we used to go there when I was a kid. I went there again as an adult later, after the war, when I was able to return home. We would picnic on the beach. There was a small landing. We would picnic on the beach. And so I grew up knowing this place very well. But we didn't talk about the history of it. We didn't talk about why it was there and what it meant. And as a kid, I guess I didn't really have, I couldn't frame the questions. I didn't have enough of the context to to ask the things that I wanted to know. But I got to know it very well, and later on, as an adult, when I went back with that, with more knowledge, I began to look at Bunce and the fort on Bunce Island in a different way. Beneath the castle, there is a cave, once an underground powder magazine, though local folklore says slaves were held there too. Step inside and you feel movement in the warm and stinking air. Hear a sound like breathing and the rustle of 1,000 wings. The cave roof is thick with bats. Beyond the old magazine, a path skirts a series of dunes, which, when I first realized that they were in fact 8-foot-high mounds of empty oyster shells, I imagined to have been tossed from the ramparts by gluttonous Englishmen. Later, I learned they were used in the making of lime for the castle walls. If memory serves, the path continues around the perimeter of the tiny island, past a small cluster of graves, which mark the last resting place of the white traders who died on Bunce. Wade into the sea by the small landing beach, and before the water has reached your knees, you can find rum bottles, wood nails, pottery shards. Within minutes, your hands are full of the jetsam and flotsam of slave ships, and you throw the lot back into the waves. Standing on the remainder of a small stone jetty, you call to the boatman on the shore, who brought you to the island and now waits to bring you back. You watch him maneuver his dugout through the waves with a single paddle. You step off the island from the same place and in the same way as did thousands of departing Africans. Only you will step off the boat again in a minute or two onto the shore, while they were transferred to the slave ships that lay anchored in deep water, and if they ever set foot on land again, did so thousands of miles away. There are stories told in Sierra Leone from centuries before I was born of men who arrived on our shores, men who built their houses on the sea. They were not ordinary men, but the spirits of drowned corpses. Left long enough in the water, a black person's skin bleaches white. They had pale hair and green eyes because they ate fish and drank seawater. They captured men and women and carried them across the sea to feed to their god, a great devil who fed on human flesh. At the thought of what awaited them, some of the captives became catatonic. In the literature of the slaving ships, it has a name, the lethargy. In the days when the prophets of Bunce went to the British Crown, the men and women and children were branded across their chests, RACE, Royal African Company of England. Race. The captives thought they were branded in order to be butchered and eaten like cattle. Catatonia causes the brain to shut down, rendering the sufferer mute and immobile. One theory suggests that catatonia may have once been an evolutionary fear response, originating in ancestral encounters with carnivores whose predatory instincts were triggered by movement. Captives struck by the lethargy often died of starvation, so the slavers stopped branding their prisoners and attached coloured strings to their wrists instead. They hired translators to explain to them what, I suppose, must have seemed a lesser fate. For a long time afterwards, people in Sierra Leone thought white people were cannibals. My stepmother remembers stories of cannibals. They were always waiting to catch children who misbehaved. One day she tells me about a colonial officer in her town who used to wait in his official car outside the railway station. She would see him when she and her friends came back from school, and sometimes he would wind down the window, call one of them over, and try to persuade her to come into the vehicle. My stepmother's grandmother warned her the man was a cannibal. She told her to run away if he ever tried to talk to her. My mother watches my expression carefully as she tells me the story. You ran from cannibals. You avoided the crossroads, the meeting place of the spirits where men and women might be snatched and carried to the underworld. At night, a grandmother urged her granddaughter returning home to the next village to stay away from the path. Only strangers who did not know the countryside traveled the paths. slave-raiding strangers perhaps, and where the roads met was the place the unlucky traveller was most likely to encounter them. The slavers were both black and white men, we know this, but it is the white man, men who could strike fear into the heart of a person such that they were turned into creatures of stone who haunt the imagination. When I was writing The Devil That Danced on the Water, I really began to try to understand my Sierra Leonean family's past, to gather the stories. I was really telling the story of my father and what had happened to him, but by going back to the 60s, going back to the 50s, the 40s, the 30s, I found myself going further and further back. I discovered that my grandfather had kept 5 indentured men, that slavery had still existed in Sierra Leone at the time when I was a child. He had kept 5 indentured men. I interviewed all the members of my family, my uncles and aunts who were still surviving, and they could remember their names, and they could remember that these men lived with them and worked on my grandfather's plantation. And then they worked and they lived and they married, but he had acquired them essentially because he was a regent chief, and he held first of all a position called Paroque, which is almost like being a chancellor. Paroque was sort of in charge of a lot of the management of the chieftaincy, and what he would do was that when somebody came before the court who couldn't pay off their debt, he would pay off their debt himself, and then he would indenture that man to him for as long as it took to pay that debt off, which may or may not happen. So I tried to understand the history of slavery in Sierra Leone and contrasted to the history of slavery in this country, to what it might have been like at the time when slavery, the triangular trade was so prevalent, and what the contrast was between slavery in West Africa and slavery in this country. Well, let me read a bit more, because I then moved to this country for the first time in 1996 when I was a fellow at Berkeley, and traveled to the south of the country and began to see the footprints of the enslaved Sierra Leoneans. This is part of my whole journey to understand. So, in 1997, I take my stepmother, who is then living with me in London after Freetown was overrun by rebel soldiers, to see the movie Amistad. We go to a cinema in Notting Hill Gate, a lovely old movie theatre with balconies and red velvet seats, one of the last cinemas where you could still smoke. The film is based on the true story of an uprising aboard the Portuguese slave ship Amistad. The rebels were Africans who had been abducted and enslaved from Sierra Leone in 1839. They killed the cook and the captain. In the film, they kill loads more people, and ordered the crew to sail them back to Sierra Leone. But before they could make it, the ship was sighted and seized by a US Navy vessel. The Portuguese slavers were freed, and the Sierra Leoneans were imprisoned in New Haven, Connecticut. In the making of the film, the director, Steven Spielberg, took a decision not to subtitle a good deal of the dialogue spoken by the African actors. Apparently, the purpose of this was to place the audience in the same position as the New Englanders, faced with the Africans babbling in an incomprehensible tongue. The Mende-speaking extras were recruited from Sierra Leone and are clearly rising to the occasion. Also, I suspect there must have been a good deal of repartee, perhaps even some ad-libbing, because my stepmother, who understands Mende, keeps giggling. Steve Spielberg had not thought of that. The Amistad, with its by then illegal cargo, was bound for Cuba, as were many ships from Bunce. Once on holiday in Havana, I went to an art exhibition where I stood before a print of an African mask. The mask was one of those designed to be worn over the entire head with rings carved into the base. The features of the face were small and keen. It looked just like one I have at home, which has its origins in the Women's Secret Society. The priestess wears it to lead the initiates in dance. I said, "It's the Bundu Devil." A man standing nearby, a Cuban and the manager of the collective of artists, heard me and told me that it was more than likely exactly what I imagined it to be. I bought the print and carried it home to London. The slave ships which crossed the Atlantic from Bunce and which were not headed for Cuba or the West Indies docked in South Carolina. From there, the captives were bought and sold to plantations around the American South. A man called Henry Laurens owned and operated Austin and Laurens, the largest slave auction house in the whole of North America. He was Henry Oswald's main trading partner, and by this time, Henry Oswald owned and ran the Bunce Island slaving fort. He was Henry Oswald's main trading partner and bought the bulk of Oswald's island captives. Once in Louisiana, in search of a more detailed understanding of the lives of slaves, I visited a plantation house near Baton Rouge. The experience was bizarre. We wandered around the house, rather poky by the standards of a British manor house, and peered into glass-fronted cabinets containing not the belongings of the family, but examples of the sort of items they would have owned, which were mainly European antiques. Nowhere, inside or out, was there any mention of the slaves who had worked the plantation. We were ushered out by a black woman in an antebellum crinoline dress. I asked her whether there were any displays about slavery we could see, slave quarters or such like. She shook her head. This way, this way. We'd seen a few French collectibles and now we were being hustled out. Finally, in the gift shop, I found one slim volume detailing the lives of slaves, entitled "We Lived in a Little Cabin in the Woods," a collection of oral accounts of surviving slaves undertaken by the Federal Writers Project. I thought that was very telling, actually, that what had survived were the stories, which is what we're talking about tonight. And the only things that nobody could obliterate were the stories that were held in the memories of people who had lived that life. In New Orleans, I discovered the slaves of Louisiana had left behind more vivid evidence of their presence in other places, in the taste of jambalaya. In making jambalaya, the rice is simmered with tomatoes, onions, and water. The recipe calls for a mix of seafood, chicken, and meat. In Sierra Leone, we have an almost identical dish we call jollof rice. You find people enjoying jollof rice all over West Africa. Jollof with a D, derived from Wolof, a people of Senegal. Jollof rice is almost certainly the progenitor of jambalaya. I've seen on Facebook great jollof rice wars, actually. I don't know if any of you follow this. Who makes the best jollof rice in the whole of West Africa? It is without a doubt to solve this once and for all the Sierra Leoneans. In New Orleans, almost certainly the progenitor of jambalaya. At home in Sierra Leone, we often serve jollof rice with a condiment made of softly fried onions and Scotch bonnet peppers. The New Orleans recipe calls for andouille sausage, which is the French influence. Every cook has his or her own way of making jambalaya. It's more of a concept, really. Once you've grasped that, you can make it anywhere with whatever is at hand. In this way, jambalaya is like gumbo, the other famous Louisiana dish, which shares the same trademark of mixed meats and fish, and the recipe for which was almost certainly carried in the hearts of the enslaved. In Louisiana, they like to make their gumbo with a roux base, the French again. But I won't have any truck with that. The West African way is to use okra. In fact, our gumbo is really comprised mainly of stewed okra into which some pieces of chicken, smoked fish, and meat are thrown. First, each okra finger must be chopped into small pieces, and then the whole thing simmered at length. Probably the dish takes about 4 hours to prepare from start to finish. It's my homecoming dish. When my stepmother instructs the cook, she will tell them, use a wooden spoon. A wooden spoon rather than a metal spoon, because wood makes the okra draw, the way I like it best. But for a good many people, the glutinous texture of okra is something of an acquired taste, hence the roux sauce. This is the first time I've read from this essay at length and talked about it, but I have read small extracts over the last few months. It came out at the end of September, and I've read a couple of times. And the last time I read that section, I went home to my house in Virginia, and I had a very, very strong urge for gumbo. I really have to have some gumbo. So, I was in the supermarket, I was in Safeways, and normally we go to get our okra from an Indian run store, but I was in Safeways, and I saw some okra, and it looked really good to me. I thought, oh, this will do. So I bought the okra, and I went to pay for it. And DC, well, the DC area, Virginia, Maryland, and DC have a big population of Sierra Leoneans, of West Africans in general, and Sierra Leoneans as well, many of whom arrived there after the war in the early 2000s. And a little old lady came and she stood behind me, and I could tell she was Sierra Leonean, right? She was so evidently Sierra Leonean. And she looked at my okra and she went, she said, that okra looks good. And I said, yeah, it does. And she said, what are you going to make? And I said, I'm going to make okra stew. And she said, I think I'll get some. So she shot off to go and buy some okra. And then I went to pay, and the guy behind the till was African American. And he said, that okra looks good. And I said, it does, doesn't it? And he said, what are you going to make? And I'm going to say, I'm going to make gumbo. And he said, oh. And he said, he joked, and he said, well, if you ever want anyone to taste it, bring it round to the store, I'll taste it for you. And I said, can you make gumbo? And he said, of course I can make gumbo. And I said, and I bet you use okra, not a roux sauce. And he said, of course I use okra. The Gullah people, who are direct descendants of Sierra Leonean slaves, make their gumbo with okra. By the time people from Sierra Leone were settled on Gullah Island, the slave coast had been renamed the Rice Coast, and slaves from Sierra Leone in particular were prized for their rice-growing expertise. Henry Lawrence himself owned several rice plantations. Captives were shipped from Bunce to Savannah to meet the demand, and the rice trade grew. South Carolina became one of the wealthiest colonies in the Americas. But malaria and disease, as well as rice, flourished in the tropical climate of the Low Countries and Sea Islands, driving away the white plantation owners who left the running of their estates to a small number of overseers and slaves acting as drivers. Free, relatively speaking, from the influence of white Christian culture, the slaves held on to their cuisine, their stories and songs. Joseph Opala, an American anthropologist who did much to stitch together the history of Bunce Island, identified as Mende the language of an old recording of a song sung by an inhabitant of Gullah. The Sierra Leoneans of Bunce brought their spirits with them too. The spirits swam, flew, and walked on water in pursuit of the scurrying ships, to live on in the religions of the Americas, in Candomblé, Santeria, Voodoo. Mamiwata, who offers great wealth to those who glimpse her in exchange for their unborn children. 1 Foot Jombi, the bogeyman who frightens children who won't go to sleep. And Baron Samedi, who holds the power of life and death and is keeper of the crossroads. As I say, I've given a couple of readings from this before, once with Marlon James, who won the Booker Prize this year, last year now, and he's Jamaican, and I mentioned Mamiwata, and he went, oh yeah, Mamiwata. He said, we've got Mamiwata. And then the next time I gave the reading was with another Jamaican called Garnet Cadogan, and I read the same passage, and he said, oh, 1 Foot Jombi, I grew up with him. So these these mythical creatures live on in quite a literal sense. We both had exactly the same memories and encounters of Mami Wata and One Foot John B. So I mentioned that my grandfather had kept indentured men, which I didn't know until I was in my 30s and I was researching the story of our family. And that spurred me really to look beyond and go further back. And so I asked my aunts and uncles, who can tell me that, who can I go to tell me more about the history of our family? Of course, everything is oral history. When my Scottish mother, who, like many retired people, had got very interested in genealogy, it's been quite a fascinating difference. When my Scottish mother got very interested in genealogy, she has done all her work through church records. She goes to church records, she goes to local council records and local government's records, marriage, death, birth and death certificates. And actually, she traced our Scottish family to, we turned out not to be very Scottish at all, actually. She traced our Scottish family to the very last village of the very last island of the Shetland Islands, which, if you know the geography, is way closer to Norway and Denmark than it is to Scotland, and in fact was owned by Denmark for very many years. And so all the names begin to change. People are no longer called, I don't know, Margaret or Eileen. They start being called Ursula as you go back a couple of hundred years. And I went off to the Shetland Islands, where large numbers of all of my family had left because they could no longer make a living on the islands. They'd all gone to the mainland in order to find work, and then a few of them had gone to Canada and Australia and New Zealand, where my mother had tracked them down, or their descendants down. But what I also discovered about the Scottish bit of the family, this is an aside really, but about the Scottish bit of the family was that actually we were mostly Vikings. Weren't Scottish at all. And that the DNA of the Shetland Islanders is about 50% Viking. So we were not who we even thought we were there. And as I discovered in Sierra Leone, we weren't really who we thought we were there either. So my family is Timni. My grandfather, as I told you, was a regent chief. Was an aristocrat, and that's what I grew up with. And I grew up we grew up in Freetown, and my grandfather lived further north, but that's what I grew up with, this great big extended family. Everybody spoke Timni, and we lived in Timniland. And then I started to ask about the family, and all my aunts and uncles said, you have to go to Auntie Adama. She's the one who knows all of this. She's the one who'll tell you. And I found my Aunt Adama, and she was in her 90s. This was just after the war in Sierra Leone. I mean, the war was still ongoing in parts of the country. The fighting was still ongoing in parts of the country. And I had gone home to Freetown, like many people did, to try and help our families. And I found my Aunt Adama living as a refugee in a compound in the east of Freetown. And I don't speak Timni. This is I fell through that cultural gap of having parents from two different countries. And I did say to my mum once, my stepmum, why didn't you teach us Timni? And she said, well, we thought you'd pick it up. But also, they used it to talk about us all the time. So it wasn't terribly likely we were going to pick it up. But I did have a strong residual understanding, and actually also of Doric. My Scottish great-grandmother apparently used to speak to me in Doric all the time, and I would answer her in Doric. But neither of those languages really had a residual understanding of them, but they hadn't really stuck. So I went off to find my Aunt Adama. She doesn't speak English. I took one of my cousins to translate. And she began this story. And she's the keeper of the family stories. The minute she began to speak, we knew we were going to hear something special. She started with the words, Parmolai was a warrior at the time of the Gabanka Wars. And this story simply unspooled for about 3 hours. And it was boiling hot. And we were sitting outside, and my cousin was translating, and at one point I said to him, do you want to take a break? Because he was doing the really hard work. I said, do you want to take a break and we'll come back tomorrow? And he said, I have never heard this story. So we stayed there. And the first thing we discovered that was Parmolai, who was our great-grandfather on the other side, was not Timney at all. He was a Locho. And she told us the story of how my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother met. Put that in inverted commas, you'll see what I mean. Parmolai was a Locho commander whose fighters overran the town of Mamunta, deep in Timniland, in an area ruled by the Obai Masamunta Akake, King Greatbeard, my great-great-grandfather. Mamunta was where Parmolai made his base until the wars were ended by the British, who, tired of the disruption to trade, captured and imprisoned Gabanka, after whom the Gabanka Wars were named. With the end of hostilities, Parmolai headed back north beyond the Katabai Hills to his village of Matoko, accompanied by the retinue of slaves given to him by Masamunta Akake as part of the peace settlement between the two men. Among the slaves was one of Masamunta's own daughters, Beas. Parmolai gifted her to his mother for her household, and later, at his mother's behest, took Beas as one of his wives, and together, over time, they had 3 sons and a daughter. One day, a basket seller arrived in the town of Matoko. Yabeas, as she was now known, recognized the weave and pattern of his shuku. They came from her hometown of Mamunta, whose weavers are, even now, renowned for their basketry. Yabeas asked the shuku seller to carry a message to her family, telling them where she was and begging that they free her. This the basket seller promised to do, but when he returned the next year, he had failed to pass on the message. For what reason, we do not know. Yabeas gave her message to him a second time and waited another year, and this time the basket seller succeeded in his mission. There were, in those days, strict rules by which a person could be redeemed from slavery. If the terms were met, then that person was free, regardless of the wishes of the owner. When 2 of Yabeas's brothers arrived in Matoko, they presented before a gathering of the chief and elders of Matoko and Parmolai this inventory of items. Cow, 1. Barrel of palm oil, 1. Sack of rice, 1. Sack of salt, 1. Tie of tobacco leaves, 1. Country cloth, 1. Silver shillings, 4. Once the ceremony had been conducted, Yabeas was a free woman, except that she wasn't. She was still Parmolai's wife. Thus, when Yabeas declared she wanted to go home to Mamunta, Parmolai declined to allow her. She had a wound on her foot, and this he used as an excuse to keep her in Matoko under the care of his healer. When her foot was better, Yabeas once again told Parmolai she planned to travel to her hometown and to take their daughter Hawa to accompany her on the journey, but Parmolai refused his permission a second time. Hawa was betrothed to a young man in Matoko, he pointed out. Yabeas needed to stay for the marriage. In the end, though, he did relent and gave Yabeas his permission to go home. He appointed their second son, Saidu, to be her travelling companion and settled down to wait for her return. But Yabeas never came back. Parmolai set out to follow his wife. The first time he entered Mamunta, he had done so as a warrior at the head of an army. Now he entered as a suitor, preceded by a young girl bearing a heavy calabash upon her head. Parmolai went to Beas' house and broke kola with her brothers, one of whom, heir to Masamunta Akake, was now king. And he presented his calabash, the contents of which would certainly have looked very much like this. Kola nuts, symbol of friendship. Bitter kola nuts, symbolic of hard times. Alligator pepper, 1. Seized to be kept in dried pod for the union to hold. Prayer mat, 1. Tie of tobacco, 1. Needle and thread. Gold, silver, precious stones. Parmolai had come to give Yabeas' family her bride gift, outstanding now for some 20 years or more. Yabias accepted the calabash, and in so doing, she accepted Pamolai for her husband, this time as a free woman. Some days after the celebrations were over, Pamolai decided it was time they returned home. When he told Yabias to prepare for the journey, Yabias said, no. She said no. And so the story goes that Pamolai returned to Matoko alone, where he died some years later, while Yabias and her son Saidu stayed in Mamunta. It is said Yabias never laid eyes on Pamolai again. Give me a moment, I've got a dry throat, and then I'll... I don't really know if Yabias and Pamolai's story ended that way. It's true she never went back to Matoko. Her son, Saidu, my grandfather, grew up in Mamunta and would one day be indentured by the same brothers who had redeemed Yabias. He would leave Mamunta and found a settlement of his own, which would become known as Rabonko, the place in the forest, and on his estate, indentured men would work. All of that is as Adama told it. What I'm saying here is that I don't know whether the last act of defiance I like to give Yabias in my retelling of the story is really true. That she looked Pamolai in the eye and spoke the word no. The last time I told Yabias' story, it was to a gathering of British people of West Indian heritage, descendants of people who had left Sierra Leone or some other African country, and who, when they left, must have guessed that they did so without hope of return or redemption. When I came to the end of the story of my great-grandmother, to Yabias' final declaration, people clapped and cheered and stamped their feet. And so I like to tell myself it really happened that way. My Aunt Adama died 1 year after we sat listening to her in that Freetown courtyard. She was the last member of our family who held the story of Yabias and Pamolai. If I had not asked her to tell it to me, we would have lost it. So many things. We would have carried on thinking we were Timneys and never discovered our great-grandfather had been a Loko. The Sierra Leoneans who landed in North Carolina and settled there and in Louisiana and around me in Virginia, all over the United States, brought with them only what they could carry in their memories and in their hearts. When I realized that, I began to understand in a small way what it might feel like to lose the story of who you are, to have it taken away from you. Thank you. It's a personal essay. It's just my, experience, my family, one story. I think that trying to put together some great kind of comprehensive story is impossible. It is the work of historians, and they try, but I think these alternative narratives, the more narratives we have, the greater picture we can build. And this is just my family's story. But I'm very happy at this point, if we have time, I don't know, do we? A little bit of time to take a few questions? Yeah?
I spent 8 years in Africa overall, east, west, and southern. I was in Sierra Leone. I didn't go to Bunchana, but I have been to Gorée Island in Senegal.
Yeah, I've been there too.
What I want to ask you is, I haven't read the book, The Memory of Love, which apparently I need to read, about the RUF, the Civil War.
It's set in the Civil War, yeah, or just up before and after.
I was in Guinea working with refugees, and I saw a few Sierra Leone men who had their hands cut off, their arms cut off. What experience did you have in Sierra Leone in that time? Were you there then, and what happened?
My family was there. By that time, I was living and working in Britain, and of an age where going home seemed like the dullest thing to do. I was, like many people who were in their 20s and 30s, I was traveling everywhere else but Sierra Leone. I felt like I'd been there. And so my last trip to Sierra Leone was 1991, And I read a little extract from that, by which time the incursion had already begun from Liberia. And then we weren't able to go back at all. I mean, every time I spoke to my stepmother, she would say, oh, you know, when the fighting's over, when the fighting's over. And of course, it ramped up and ramped up and ramped up until 1997, with the first invasion of Freetown. My parents were forced to leave. It was my stepmother. My father, of course, was dead by that time, but my mother had remarried. And they were forced to leave. They came to Britain as Sierra Leone as refugees, and they came out during the bombing of the Mamiyoko, the great fight at the Mamiyoko, where the Americans brought in warships. And actually, they would not have been able to leave. The British weren't doing very much, weren't doing anything at all, actually. But the Americans were taking people out. And I do write about it in this essay. Had an extraordinary campaign to remove their citizens. One of my uncles had at one point, what had he done? He'd been to America, had a kid here, gone back to Sierra Leone. His son happens to have a Sierra Leonean American passport, which nobody was thinking about. And during the 2 days in which the Americans moved their citizens out of Freetown during the first invasion, he just had this big bang on his door, opened it, and there was a US Marine saying, I've come to take the citizen, who was 9. And so my uncle said, well, not unless I can go too. So they got evacuated. My parents managed to get out only because, so they were in the peninsula where a lot of the shelling and the fighting was taking place. And because they had to leave their home. They had gone from safe house to safe house. And they happened to belong to people the RUF were looking for. So they went there and they got onto one of the ships that were leaving, one of the warships, because an American friend of theirs wrote their name down on the manifesto. He said, I'll go forward and write your names down so they don't see you and see that you're Sierra Leonean. And in the whole thing, they managed to get out. And actually, I was living here at the time. I was at Berkeley. My sister picked them up from the airport. And they had absolutely nothing with them. She went to the airport in Gatwick, and there were, friends of ours still bloodied from the fighting that they had seen. So I went back to Britain, and my mum stayed with me as a refugee from mid-1997 to late 1998, where we made the biggest misjudgment of our lives because we thought it was safe for her to go back. And so she went back in December of 1998, and of course, January of 1999 was the huge invasion of Freetown. At that point, she and I were in communication. Now, war is shown on television now. Cameras have more access. What was so strange about all of that was I was in London in perfect safety, and I could speak to my mother on the phone, and I could hear shells going off around her. And we were having conversations. One, for example, the very last conversation we had before all the lines, the exchange was bombed, in fact, and all the lines went down, was she was saying, where she'd left her car parked outside the gates of the house, and she was really frightened that, not that it was so much that it would be stolen, because the car didn't have that much value, but that the rebel soldiers, seeing a middle-class house, would then, and that is in fact what did happen. They were raided by rebel soldiers, but they managed to survive that. So that was my family in Freetown, and then my family who were in up country in Robonko, which I referred to, the village my grandfather founded and had his plantation. They were right at the epicenter. The RUF headquarters was in McCaney, and that's just a few miles away, and they had a very hard time. But Robonko has this extraordinary geographical advantage, which is that it lies in the oxbow of a river. So there's only one point of entry to the village. And so they did have incursions from the RUF very early on. Every woman in my family was raped, for example. But after the first incursion, they were able to put lookouts just on that one point to the village. And every time they saw the RUF coming, they ran and hid. Some people were taken away. Some young women and young men were taken away by the RUF. But more or less, they came out of it better than an awful lot of communities. They didn't suffer a huge number of atrocities. And in fact, a lot of people started hiding their children there because of this natural advantage. So I was in Britain for most of it. I was in America for part of it, and Britain for most of it. And I went back home in 2000. The end of the war officially was 2002. I went back to help my family. I'd started writing The Devil That Danced on the Water. At that point, not realizing, not really having made what now to me is so obvious, that connection between the 1960s and 1970s and what was happening now. And it really informed all of my writing career, was to trace how countries implode, how one thing happens, and 40 years later, you have a country that has torn itself apart in war. And I went up country to find my family up there. Nobody had managed to get there for the last 10 years. I managed to get onto a UN convoy, and they took me up. And I went to the RUF headquarters. I'm not a war correspondent, it's not what I do, but I had some experience of what it might be like. And that was the story. And then after, from 2000, I pretty much spent several months there until things had settled down considerably, really until the last few years. And then, of course, we had the Ebola thing, so it all started up again. But no, I was fortunate not to be there for that, but certainly every single member of my family was. Yeah?
Thank you so much. I enjoyed your last story. But let me ask you, I'm wondering how much of your own experiences have been woven in that last story that you just gave. Then secondly, the other thing that interests me is it appears to you as though the Sierra Leoneans discourse on slavery is not, they're free, they kind of talk about it freely. And I say this because when I visited Ghana and I was involved in the slavery stuff, you find that the communities there do not want to talk about the slave
Yeah.
issue. So I'm wondering, how is it in Sierra Leone?
Yeah, a bit like here, actually. No one wants to talk about it. I'm kind of amazed. I was sort of amazed, I'm taking a slight aside on that, at how little I've asked. When I was writing this essay, I asked all my American friends, how much about slavery were you taught when you were at school? And very little. And the same in Sierra Leone, very little. Virtually nothing is formally taught in the schools about the history of slavery. When I cast my mind back to the main history textbook, it is in there, and it's written by a pretty good historian, and it is in there, but it is not a major part of the curriculum at all. As it is not in Britain. As I say, Britain only tells the story of ending the slave trade. It doesn't tell the story of having been a large part of the slave trade. And as here as well, I don't find many white Americans very keen to talk about it. So it's not a big part of the Sierra Leonean narrative. I think it's, one of the reasons I really wanted to tell this story about my own family and the way that slavery unfolded in my family is because another narrative has arisen, which is, if you were not enslaved, you were a slaver. Right, and I've heard that over and over again. If I say I'm from Sierra Leone and I say the kind of family I come from, somebody will say, oh yeah, well, you sold your relatives. And I've heard that from African Americans as well. And I was on stage in New Orleans last month, and the African American woman said to us, well, you slavers. And so that's the narrative, I think, which has closed down, or is partly responsible for closing down that conversation. It is certainly the case, of course, we know that West Africans were also slavers, we know that. But that idea that you were one or the other, and actually, one of the great unspokens is how much slavery was going on in Africa at that time. You could be a slave in Africa as much as you could have been transported in the triangular trade. It was actually happening on a global level, and it still is happening on a global level. We know that. If you buy shrimps, you're almost certainly eating a product that was gathered using slave labor. It still carries on. But the idea that it's one or the other. So one of the things I really wanted to write about in this essay was, if you look at the case of my grandfather, you know, he gets indentured. You know, he gets indentured, and then when he's free, he goes off and starts a plantation, and he indentures men. So you could be both things in the same life. And it didn't depend on the colour of your skin. It was not codified in race. So it's a more complex picture than the picture that has, you know, the popular idea of how slavery operated in West Africa you know, at that time and recently. So I think I mean, do I find Sierra Leoneans disinclined to talk about it? I'm sort of surprised about you say that about Ghana, because what I'd understood about Ghana was that they've made quite a big effort with, when I was there, I went to Elmina. You know, they seem to have made quite a big effort to memorialize what happened, which hasn't yet happened in Sierra Leone. Bunce, mostly really because of Joseph Apala, Bunce has had some work done to it in terms of the research and narrative and also in the structures. But I don't think Sierra Leoneans are particularly interested in the history. It's something that happened, but I haven't encountered a huge amount of shame about it.
In the interior, you get into the interior, get away from the castles, and you get into the interior. That discourse is different. The discourse becomes different.
Well, that's where my family come from. So the discourse, what would you say about the discourse in the interior?
There's that cagedness, there's that idea of not wanting to talk about it, because then it antagonizes the people. It antagonizes the communities there. And so it's easier. And you know very well that the castles, normally it's performance.
Yeah, yeah.
It's performance for the outside audience. And when you go in the interior, it becomes something that they begin to talk about it, and they're ashamed of it. They're ashamed of it, and they still think that slavery is still going to come. I mean, that's what I was involved in this memory kind of thing of slavery, which is sponsored by Professor in 1998 for 6 months, and we went around, and it was quite revealing to me.
Well, I bow to your knowledge because I'm not a researcher. I told only the story of my family, possibly because they were telling me and they have trusted me with their narratives over the years, because it's not the first time I've written about them. They didn't show any particular, the story was given to me in a very matter-of-fact way, but that might just be the privilege of my position, that I have narrated the stories of my family over and over again, and they felt that I wouldn't bring a particular kind of judgment to it. But it's not something that I've spent a huge amount of time in Sierra Leone discussing. I bow to your knowledge, really. The other part of your question, how much of that last story was from my experience? Well, it all is. I mean, I wasn't there, obviously, it was 1890, but that's the story as it was given to me by my aunt, and that's the interpretation that I gave on to the ending of the story, that as she told it to.
This is what I tell the students when I'm teaching the history. I tell them when I'm teaching the history that I'm giving them, first and foremost, it's my experience. It's my touch to that history that comes out. And so the facts are there. The facts will always remain facts. But the interpretation.
Yeah. But that's clear, isn't it?
How much of that has been woven in your own narrative or your reinterpretation?
Well, I think in the reading it's clear that she tells me the story one way, and I decide that I want to hear the story that way, that Yabias is, doesn't just say no and, carry on with the cooking, that she is making this an act of defiance, and then, I interrogate my own motives. I'm not sure whether she did it that way or not. So that's exactly as I've told it. I think when you write memoir, as opposed to when you write history, when you write memoir, the key to memoir, I think, is that you can take your reader into your confidence and say, this is how I see it. That's how I saw it. Number one, this is our story. This is not a universal story. It's not everybody's story. This is our story. I mean, hopefully it's a universal narrative, but it's not everybody's story. And secondly, you know, this is what I make of it. Somebody else might have made something completely different. Maybe my ideas were totally fanciful about the way that that final scene played out. But certainly in terms of the way my Aunt Adama told the story, I fact-checked a lot of it. Right? All the bits that I could. For example, when she talked about the Banker Wars, I went and fact-checked all of that in the library. There was not much written on it, I can tell you that. There was very, very little. But her dates all panned out absolutely perfectly. So, you know, it's the best one can do, really. Yeah?
That makes me think of how differently stories are told in my family, depending on who's telling it, and I wonder if you could speak to gender culture and if you've noticed differences in storytelling depending on whether it's men's groups or women's groups telling stories.
Well, I wrote my novel Ancestor Stones is a novel written in stories, and the conceit of Ancestor Stones is of 4 women who all come from the same family, and they're telling stories to a younger relative, to a niece. And I framed those stories because of... I had the idea for the book. I mean, people think it's my family, but it's not my family. People just assume that it's all autobiographical. It's not my family, but I was inspired by researching the stories of my family, and particularly the way in which the women told their stories. So Adama was the official narrator, right? She was the official narrator, and she had the whole story. And that is a job that might go to a man, but usually it's the eldest person in the family, really, who holds that position. But all the other stories, I call them back of house, what I call them and we call them is back of house stories and front of house stories. And so Ancestor Stones is a collection of fictional back of house stories. They're the stories that are told by the women at the back of the house, and they are not the official narrative of the family. They are different from the official narrative of the family. I don't know if I think there's a big gender difference. I'm not really big on gender difference. I don't know if I think there is a big gender difference when you're talking to people personally about their stories. The one thing I did discover, when I was writing Ancestor Stones and researching it, I couldn't research any of this stuff in a library, right? To ask what they wore when they got married in 1920. How did women make themselves up before the advent of commercial cosmetics? You know, all of those little details simply were not there in a library to be had. And I don't research any of my books in libraries. I always research them by talking to people, by going to places and talking to people. And I did that in Sierra Leone with Ancestor Stones. And just anybody would talk to me, frankly. Any woman over a certain age who would talk to me, I'd sit down and do an interview with. And this became such a thing. I'd already published The Devil That Danced on the Water, so I already had a reputation as a writer. But this became such a thing that I thought I was going to have trouble getting women to talk to me about their younger selves. They had no problem whatsoever. I prefaced every interview by saying, this is a work of fiction. I mean, of course, most of the women couldn't read or write, but I explained, I'm making up stories. I'm not telling your story. I will not put your story on the page. I will take details from it, and I will make another story. They didn't care. They didn't care. And what became absolutely apparent in the writing of that book, particularly actually when it came out and people started to read it, and one of my cousins said to me, why is Aminata telling these stories? And then he said, as he read the book, he thought, oh, I get this, right? Because it was telling the story of the country, but also of these individual lives. And the number of women who just loved that book, and they absolutely adored it. I would be stopped in the streets. Women who couldn't read were having it read to them. You know, there's a wonderful thing we do where the literate person reads in the evening in small communities, in Freetown as well as up country. A literate person, if there's a book everybody wants to know about, like The Devil That Danced on the Water or Ancestor Stones, in my case, the literate person reads a chapter out every night and people come and listen. And he just, or she, usually he, but she or he just keeps going through the book, so you might come in at chapter 13, you just carry on until it comes back around again. And they all loved it, and it really came down to, you know, Zizi Dangaremba, the Zimbabwean writer, and she famously said that she started to write novels because she had never seen herself in literature, and she wanted to see herself there. And what I discovered with the reception among women to that book was they were finally seeing themselves in literature. Somebody was telling their stories.
Did you notice that 2 days ago in Minnesota, a Somali-American woman was elected to the state legislature?
I did, yeah, I did. There's something. I think I'll take another question and then leave it at that. If there is. Yeah.
Has your writing been translated, or can you tell a little more about when women or when your audiences read your work in I guess, Hindi or languages?
Yeah, my work's been translated to many languages. With Slovenian and Chinese probably being the furthest away from. Yeah, it's been translated into lots of languages. Because a lot of my work is, a big theme is conflict, I find different audiences take different things. Western audiences tend to look at the personal stories. I mean, this is a big generalization, but to keep this reasonably short, forgive me if I do generalize, Western audiences seem to be more focused on the personal stories. And audiences from outside the West are interested in the bigger narratives. So what I say is, if I give a talk at a literary festival in Britain, I will be asked about whether I find writing therapeutic. If I go Sri Lanka, right, for example, I went to Sri Lanka. It was to a literary festival. There was talk about whether we should be boycotting the festival because the government was persecuting writers. We decided to go. I was really glad I decided to go because what happened was we talked about all of my novels, and instead of using the word Sri Lanka, we used the word Sierra Leone. We were breaking, all the unwritten rules about what you were and weren't allowed to talk about in Sri Lanka. We were using the cover of this other war in this other country to talk about Sri Lanka. And the questions there are not, do you find writing therapeutic? They're, Miss Fauna, what are the lessons for our political leaders in Sri Lanka? Or what are the lessons for... So, there's a very different focus. And I find that the books they've I've spoken in Colombia, I've spoken in Sri Lanka, I've spoken in Pakistan, in the former Yugoslavia. The former Yugoslavia is really interesting because they're very interested in ideas of reconciliation taken from the Sierra Leonean model about, because there's been very little reconciliation in the former Yugoslavia post-war. So yeah, different things in different places. And then the other thing I really notice is how the humor changes, which audiences laugh at which things. And there's a whole to and fro about who do you write for, and if you're an African writer, should you write for an African audience, or should you take into account a Western audience? And everyone, now you mustn't write for a Western audience. Well, I write for all audiences. I really do not specify. I come from both worlds, and I absolutely write for both audiences. And when I write my books, they're multi-layered, and depending who you are in the world and how far away you stand in relation to that culture, you read at a different level. And so what I do is my view is this, right? Somebody who's never set foot in Sierra Leone, let's say, for example, my mother-in-law, who's never been outside Europe, she must get to understand, I must write in a way that she understands that culture and sees herself in it in a way that she wouldn't otherwise, right? That's her way in. And she has the advantage of novelty. That's all new to her. When I write, and I think of my stepmother, who's one of my biggest readers. She reads all my books before when they're in manuscript form. I think she must see things in her own culture that she never saw before, right? That she knew but hadn't actually seen before. And so that's what I try to do. So I kind of hide things, psych, I don't know. what my metaphor is. It's like layers, but then I hide things in the layers. And I don't know, it's like pass the parcel or something with their little gifts under each wrapping. So the Westerners are really kind of happy with the wrapping, but you know, whether you're, I don't know, you know, Nigerian, Sierra Leonean, and then it comes right down to if you're a Timney woman, you get jokes that nobody else gets. So there's, and I don't translate the jokes. So there's one, for example, in among the Timney, you know, there's big polygamous. It is still polygamous, but my grandfather had 16 wives. There's no way he was going to get round to all his wives and leave them happy. Let me just say that, put it like that. So there's an understanding that younger wives may take lovers. And the people who cover for the younger wives are the older wives, right? They enable and they keep it quiet. And typically, if a husband asks where one of his younger wives is, and they are covering for her spending time with a lover, they say she's out gathering firewood. Now, I put that in, but I didn't translate it. It was one of my little, you know. So Timney women find it very funny when they come to that passage, because they know exactly what it means. And so, yeah, that's what I do. And I write in different ways for different people and hope everybody gets something from it. Yeah. Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.